Thank you so much for watching our videos. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the bell for new videos. No one ever says no to Damien Blackwell. When the world speaks of power, it often speaks in the language of currency, influence, and control. And Damien, he was fluent in all three. The man had built empires while most people were still building resumes. Ruthless in the boardroom, charming in the media, and a ghost. When it came to personal relationships, Damien Blackwell had never been seen with the same woman twice. At least, not until the day he decided he needed but not a real one. A temporary one. Not for love, not for companionship, but for business. The need arose from a delicate merger with a conservative, family-run conglomerate based overseas. These were traditional people-family men, legacy protectors, men who didn't trust those who played fast and loose with their image, the kind who didn't deal with bachelors who couldn't prove they understood commitment. And so, as strange as it sounded, Damien's his long-suffering assistant, Meredith, came to him with an unusual proposal. You need a wife, or at least someone who can play the part. The suggestion was ridiculous. He scoffed at first, but then he realized there was logic in it. This merger was worth billions. A company that could double his global reach, and all they wanted was to see that he was settled, that he had someone by his side. Someone who could smile in photographs, attend galas, sit beside him at family dinners, and call him darling in front of the press. He didn't need a wife. He needed a performance. And for that, he needed an actress. Or better yet, someone authentic enough to seem real, someone who didn't come from his world, so there'd be no risk of blackmail. No ulterior motives, no ambition to climb higher on his name. He needed someone who wouldn't fall for him, someone immune to the empire of Damien Blackwell. It was at a downtown cafe, of all places, where he first saw her. Not in a glamorous setting, not in the halls of power, but in a coffee shop he rarely entered, driven there by a rare whim and a recommendation from his assistant. A place known for its pastries and quiet corner tables. She wasn't what he expected. No makeup. Hair tied up loosely. Her apron stained with coffee. She moved between tables with a rhythm that was more functional than graceful. And yet, there was something magnetic about her. Maybe it was the way she didn't look up when he entered. Maybe it was the fact that she treated him like any other customer. No smile, no flirtation, no recognition. He ordered black coffee. She handed it to him without a word. He said, "Don't I get a smile?" She replied, "Only if you tip." That was the moment. That sharp tongue. That lack of interest. He asked Meredith to run a background check within the hour. Her name was Callie Hart, 27. No criminal record, no debt. A high GPA from a state university. But more interestingly, she had a past filled with setbacks. A sick mother, a dropped scholarship, and a younger brother in school. She worked 2 jobs and still managed to pay her bills. No sugar daddies, no OnlyFans, no shortcuts. She didn't chase men. She didn't care for billionaires. She was perfect. And so, 2 days later, he returned. This time, he waited until her shift ended. She spotted him leaning against his black Bentley like he was posing for a magazine. "Let me guess," she said. "You want another coffee?" "No," Damien replied. "This time, I'm offering you something. Unless it's a car or a miracle, I'm not interested. I want to hire you to be my... She blinked twice, then laughed in his face. The story of how a billionaire proposes a contract marriage to a waitress should have been absurd. But this one's some fairy tale. Kali didn't believe in those. She refused outright. Damien, used to getting what he wanted, wasn't deterred. 2 months, he said. You'll be paid 7 figures. You'll live in my penthouse, wear designer clothes, travel in private jets, eat food made by Michelin star chefs. You'll just have to smile beside me and pretend to be wildly in love. I'll even throw in a clause that says, no touching, no sleeping arrangements, and total freedom when this ends. You think I'd sell my name and time for a few designer bags and a view? I think you're smart enough to know what $1 million could do for your life. That night, she said no again, but she couldn't sleep. Her mother's medical bills were piling up. Her brother's tuition was due in 3 months. She'd been stuck in survival mode for 5 years. The next morning, she called him back. There were papers, clauses, non-disclosure agreements, boundaries, everything outlined in legal language that made the whole thing sound sterile and calculated, which it was, except it didn't feel that way. Not when she stepped into his penthouse and saw the coldness of his world, the emptiness, the lack of photos, the minimalism, the silence. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum, a very expensive museum with no soul. You live here alone? She asked. He nodded. No wonder you're paying someone to talk to you. He chuckled. It was the first time he laughed around her. Rehearsals began. Sort of. They practiced holding hands, smiling for fake selfies. She had to memorize details about his life. Favorite color, childhood dog, first business deal. She teased him constantly. You were kicked out of prep school for hacking the school's servers. Seriously, I was bored. You're exhausting. And yet, he looked forward to their evenings together. He, who never cared for company, he started staying home more. Canceling dates with models, skipping meetings to have dinner with her, even if it was just takeout and sarcasm. One night, she brought a board game. He'd never played one before. You've never played Scrabble. Is that the one with the tiny wooden squares? He was terrible at it. She loved every second. What was supposed to be a cold contract began to shift. Not because of grand gestures, but because of the quiet moments. The way she yawned when she was tired and didn't care to hide it. The way she danced in the kitchen when she thought he wasn't watching. The way she challenged him, called him out, told him when he was being arrogant or unfair. She didn't worship him. She didn't even particularly like him some days. And that made him feel in public. They became the perfect couple. Photo shoots, charity events, business dinners. Everyone believed the act. What they didn't see was how, in private, the line between pretending and feeling was getting harder to find. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever known. And Damien, for the first time in his carefully calculated life, found himself caught off guard, not by a business rival, not by market changes, but by his own heart, a heart he'd spent years keeping locked away, until a waitress walked in and refused to play by his rules. Coley Hart had always believed that strength wasn't about how loudly you spoke, but how firmly you stood when the world tried to push you over. And that belief was never tested more than the day a man in a tailored suit and impossible confidence offered her a life she never asked for. Or, to be more specific, offered her a role. Pretend to be his loving, doting for 2 months in exchange for $1 million. She remembered the way he said it, as if it were a business pitch, as if she were just another name on a contract. An asset, but Coley wasn't an asset. She was a human being. And the first word that came out of her mouth. No. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, delivered with the same tone she used when refusing overtime at the diner. Damien Blackwell, didn't they? Tekie? Well, no one said no to him. Especially not a woman who made her living clearing coffee cups and serving burnt toast to grumpy customers. But Coley didn't care about his money or his name. In fact, that was part of the problem. He was the embodiment of everything she distrusted: powerful, detached, and far too used to getting what he wanted with a signature or a smile. And yet, something about his offer lingered. It wasn't the money. Not exactly. It was what that money could do. The oxygen it could bring into a life that had been suffocating for years. After she turned him down, Coley returned to her routine. Waking up at 5 a.m., brewing coffee at the diner, dodging leers from customers, rushing to the pharmacy during her lunch break to pick up medication for her mother, and clocking into her second shift at a late-night bookstore. Every step of her day was a reminder that survival wasn't glamorous. At night, she'd lie in bed in the tiny room she shared with her mom, listening to the soft wheeze of a breathing machine, doing mental math with the bills on her nightstand. She'd been doing that dance for so long, she'd forgotten what rest felt like. Then the hospital called. Her mother needed a new treatment, one that insurance wouldn't cover, one that costs more than half a year's worth of wages. Kali stared at the phone for a long time after the call ended. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she put on the same stained apron and went to work, and she saw him again. Damien, sitting at a corner booth, reading a newspaper he clearly wasn't interested in. Waiting, she approached him like a storm cloud. "This a habit of yours?" she asked. "Stalking women who reject you." He folded the paper slowly, not meeting her gaze. "No. But I've been thinking, maybe I underestimated you." She snorted. "You think?" He looked up then, directly into her eyes. Not with arrogance this time, but something almost human. "You're not like the others," he said. "You don't want anything from me. You have nothing I need, except $1 million. She stiffened. He saw it. That flicker of something. The wall she'd built had a crack. He stood. Handed her a business card. "My offer still stands. Call me when you're ready to negotiate." She held on to that card for 3 more days. She didn't call, but she thought about it constantly. When the power flickered in their apartment because of an overdue bill. When her mom cried quietly over her failing medication. When her brother sent a message saying he might have to drop out of school. Coley wasn't greedy, she wasn't vain, but she wasn't stupid either. So she called. Their second meeting was less dramatic. Damien arranged for a private car to pick her up. She wore the nicest thing. She owned a faded blue dress that hugged her figure, but didn't distract from the wear on the fabric. She sat across from him in a high-rise office that smelled like wealth and old decisions. "I'm not a toy," she began, before he could speak. I never said you were. You don't owe me just because you can afford to rent my time. He gave a small smile. That's the first thing we agree on. And then he slid a folder across the table. Inside, she found a contract. Carefully crafted. Clean. Detailed. She read every word. No intimacy, she asked, arching a brow. He nodded. None required. No expectation of actual affection? None. She flipped to the next page. You want me to attend 5 major public events? Stay in your penthouse. Accompany you on an international trip. Learn facts about your life and pretend to be madly in love with you. Precisely. She closed the folder slowly, then looked him dead in the eyes. You're lonely. His jaw tensed. I'm practical. No, she said. You're afraid. You've built walls so high that now you need to hire someone to climb over them with you. He leaned back in his chair, more intrigued than insulted. You're also arrogant, she added, and a little annoying. And yet, you're still here. Because life isn't fair, she said softly, and I'm tired of pretending I'm strong enough to carry it all alone. They signed the contract 2 days later. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. But Kali made one thing clear. This doesn't mean I like you. Wouldn't dream of it, Damien replied, with the faintest smirk. Her first day in his world was like landing on another planet. The car that picked her up had a mini fridge stocked with sparkling water and chocolate-covered strawberries. The building they pulled into was so tall it made her dizzy to look up at it. His penthouse was bigger than the floor of her entire apartment building. A stylist was waiting for her inside. So was a personal chef. I like pasta, she told the chef. The kind with too much cheese. The man nodded politely, as if she'd just recited a Shakespearean sonnet. She laughed. What? Nothing, Damien said from the corner, watching her. Just, you're different, no kidding. The first few days were awkward. She was used to crowded buses, cheap soap, and instant coffee. He was used to silence, precision, and people who didn't talk back. But Kali talked back. A lot. When he suggested she'll dye her hair to match his public aesthetic, she refused. When he tried to dictate what she should wear to the first event, she raised an eyebrow and chose something that wasn't on the approved lists. Something bold and red. You don't follow instructions well, he muttered. I wasn't hired to follow, she said. I was hired to convince. You want Heao? Let me be real. It was the first time he realized he'd chosen someone who wouldn't mold to fit his image. And strangely, he didn't hate it. They rehearsed their story over candlelit dinners that weren't dates, practiced affectionate gestures that made her roll her eyes. You want me to swoon when you touch my hand? She teased one evening. You don't have the charm for that. I have a private island, he countered. Still not enough. And every time she pushed back, something in him stirred, something unfamiliar. Kali had walked into his world with worn shoes and sharp wit end, turned his perfectly calibrated existence upside down. He hired her because she was practical, unimpressed, untouched by his world. But what he hadn't expected was how much her no meant more than all the yeses he'd verbat, because the woman who said no first was the only one who ever made him want a yes that couldn't be written into a contract. The first time Kali had to kiss Damien in public, it wasn't romantic. It was rehearsed, calculated, a moment designed for flashbulbs and headlines, not heartbeats. They stood on the red carpet of a luxury gala hosted in the heart of Manhattan. event filled with billionaires, politicians, and the kind of people who treated champagne like water. Damien wore a midnight black tuxedo like it was sewn into his DNA. Coley wore a sapphire gown loaned from a Paris designer she couldn't even pronounce. As cameras surrounded them, someone shouted, "Mr. Blackwell, over here, give us a kiss." He leaned in. She didn't flinch, but she didn't melt either. She let him touch his lips gently to hers, nothing more than a whisper of a kiss. The crowd cheered, the cameras flashed, and in that moment, they became exactly what the world wanted them to be. Madly in love. But beneath the surface, they were just two strangers performing a well-funded lie. Life with Damien Blackwell quickly became an act. Every morning, Coley would wake up in the guest wing of his penthouse, get dressed in outfits chosen by his stylist, and meet him in the dining room where breakfast was already served: French pastries, fresh squeezed juices, eggs with herbs flown in from Italy. "Do you really eat like this every day?" she once asked, picking at a croissant. "No," he replied, sipping espresso. "Most days, I forget to eat at all." And that was the first crack, the first glimpse of something real. They spent hours rehearsing their relationship down to the smallest details. How they met, what song was playing, their first date. Inside jokes they had to invent, pet names. Damien took it seriously. Coley found it ridiculous. "Wait," she said one evening. "You want me to pretend we shared our first kiss under a tree during a rainstorm? It as romantic. It's effective." She rolled her eyes. "If you want believable, we should say we met while arguing over the last bag of coffee beans." "You really think that sounds better? It sounds real." He didn't say it out loud, but he agreed. Her version made him smile. In public, they were flawless. He'd hold her hand like it belonged there. She'd lean into his touch like it comforted her. At dinners, she'd laugh at the right moments. At fundraisers, she'd whisper in his ear like she was telling a secret when, really, she was listing the appetizers by calorie count. At one particular gala, an investor's wife leaned over and whispered to Kali, "You're good for him. He's different with you." Softer Kali didn't know how to respond to that, because the truth was he was different. And she didn't know what that meant. But behind the curtain of performances, something unexpected began to bloom. It started in small, quiet ways, like how he began making sure she had her favorite tea stocked in the kitchen, or how he'd ask about her mother's health, not out of obligation, but genuine concern, or how he once rearranged a meeting so he could take her to an art exhibit she'd casually mentioned wanting to see. They weren't supposed to share real moments, but they did. One night, during a charity auction, they were seated next to a couple who had been married for 30 years. The wife kept talking about how they fell in love dancing to jazz in their college dorm room. As Coley listened, she glanced at Damien. He wasn't smiling. He looked uncomfortable. She leaned in. "Are you okay?" He shook his head slightly. "Too many memories." "Of what?" "My parents." That was the first time he ever brought them up, and it was the first time she realized he wasn't a statue. He had history. He had hurt. He just didn't wear it where anyone could see. And then came the night that changed everything. They were scheduled for a formal dinner with one of Damien's international business partners and his traditionalist family. The setting was lavish crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, gold-trimmed menus. Coley was expected to act like a perfect. What no one expected was that she'd become the center of attention. the partner's wife, an elegant woman with curious eyes, leaned forward during the meal. "Tell me, Coley, what's the secret to loving a man like Mr. Blackwell? He's complex." Coley smiled tightly. She knew the room was watching, and for a moment she felt the weight of the performance pressing down on her. But then she told the truth, or at least something close to it. "I think," she said slowly, "that you have to love the part of him that no one else sees. The part behind the silence, the part that doesn't show up in headlines or stock reports." There was a pause. Then the woman nodded. "That's very wise." Damien said nothing the rest of the night, but as they walked back to the car, he took her hand gently, deliberately. It wasn't for the cameras. There were no cameras. After that night, the energy between them shifted. Their rehearsals became fewer, their moments more unspoken. He began to read her silences. She began to memorize the look in his eyes when he was tired or stressed or scared. They shared laughter that wasn't rehearsed, teased each other without needing an audience. And sometimes, when the world wasn't watching, Coley would catch him looking at her not like a business partner, but like a man falling into something he couldn't name. Then came the trip, a week-long journey to Europe to finalize the deal. They stayed in a centuries-old chateau surrounded by vineyards and the kind of opulence Coley had only ever seen in history books. Their suite had one bed, a mistake, according to the hotel staff. "We can change it," Damien offered immediately. But Kali paused. "It's fine," she said. "We're adults." And that night, they both laid awake in silence, staring at the ceiling, closer than they'd ever been, and yet still worlds apart. Until Damien spoke. "I was 11 when I learned to lie." Coley turned to him in the dark. "What happened?" "My father was cheating on my mother. I caught him. She asked me if I'd seen anything. I said no." A long silence followed. "That's when I realized sometimes lies are the only thing that keeps the world from collapsing." Coley didn't say anything. She just reached over and held his hand. Not because the script called for it, but because he needed it. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't touch. But something irreversible happened between them. The kind of shift that couldn't be undone. Because when you spend enough time pretending to be in love, your heart starts to forget it's acting. By the time they returned home, the lines between performance and reality had fully blurred. Kali no longer knew if the way he looked at her in meetings was scripted. Damien no longer knew if the way she smiled when he whispered jokes into her ear was part of the contract. Their lie had grown roots, and it was now growing in directions neither could control. The performance had become the truth, but neither was brave enough to say it out loud, because the moment they did, the act would be over, and that somehow was more terrifying than the lie. The contract had been clear. No affection behind closed doors, no real emotions, no crossing the line. It was business, always business. 2 signatures on paper, 2 people playing roles, but no one warned them what happens when a heart doesn't read fine print. And a heart, they never care about clauses. The first rule to break was silence. Coley noticed it one rainy afternoon when Damien returned home earlier than usual. He didn't head straight to his office or pour himself a drink like always. He found her sitting in the living room, reading a book she'd taken from his massive, untouched library, Without a word, he sat beside her, not across from her. Beside her, close enough that their elbows nearly touched. And then, without looking up, he asked, "Do you believe in soulmates?" She blinked. That wasn't in the script. "No," she answered honestly. "I believe in timing, in choices, in people who don't give up on each other." He didn't reply right away, just stared out the window. "I don't believe in much," he said finally. "But you believe in contracts?" she whispered. He smiled, and for the first time, it looked sad. The second rule to fall was distance. Kali's mother had a health scare, the kind of thing that stops the world for a moment and makes everything else feel irrelevant. Damien found her pacing the balcony, her fussy polyphone trembling in her hand. "She collapsed," Coley said, her voice breaking. "I need to go." Now, Damien didn't hesitate. He canceled 3 meetings, arranged for a private jet, and flew with her to the hospital. He didn't need to. No one would have questioned his absence, but he did it anyway. And when she cried in that cold hospital hallway, unsure if her mother would wake up, Damien sat beside her and took her hand in both of his. No cameras, no audience, no performance. Just a man trying to hold together the woman who was slowly taking apart his carefully constructed world. The third rule shattered one morning in the kitchen. She was making pancakes. He was reading the newspaper. A familiar rhythm had settled into their lives. Coffee at Sechi, silence until 7:30, then casual insults traded over toast. But that morning, as she flipped the final pancake, he looked up and said it. "You make this place feel like a home." She froze. Not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. Like it scared him. Like he didn't mean to say it out loud. She turned slowly. "What did you say?" But he just looked away, muttered something about a meeting, and left the room. The pancake burned, and she didn't notice until the fire alarm screamed. The fourth rule was the most dangerous. They started caring not in grand declarations, but in the quiet, irreversible ways people do when they begin to fall. He began walking her to her room each night. She began waiting for him to come home before she went to bed. He started noticing when she was anxious, and she started learning the names of his childhood scars. There was a scar on his shoulder from a bicycle accident, one on his wrist from a broken bottle during a fight at boarding school, and one on his heart that he never spoke about what she felt. Every time he looked at her like she was something he could never quite deserve. One night, he found her asleep on the couch. She was curled up, book on her chest, hair messy, face peaceful. He stood there for a long time, just watching. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached down and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. No act, no performance, just breath and silence. "I should go to bed," she whispered. He nodded, but neither of them moved. They shared their first real kiss a week later. It wasn't on a red carpet or in front of paparazzi. It was in the kitchen at midnight, after she'd snuck down for ice cream. He joined her, barefoot, wearing sweatpants instead of his usual armor of expensive suits. She offered him a spoon. He took it. They sat on the counter, eating from the same tub, their knees bumping. She laughed at something he said. He laughed back, and then the silence returned, not awkward, but charged. He looked at her. She looked back, and then he kissed her. It was soft, unsure, like he was asking a question he didn't know how to phrase, and she answered it by not pulling away. That kiss rewrote the contract in invisible ink. From that night on, the rules weren't just bending, they were breaking under the weight of what neither dared admit out loud. They began spending more time together, even when the cameras weren't watching. She'd help him pick ties for meetings. He'd wait for her by the elevator just to walk her to dinner. They watched movies in the dark, their legs tangled, pretending it didn't mean anything, but it did. God, it did. And then came the night she got sick. A bad flu, fever, chills, exhaustion. She tried to downplay it, insisting she just needed rest. But Damien wasn't having it. He stayed by her side all night, held her hair back when she threw up, put cold cloves on her forehead, sat beside her bed, reading until she fell asleep. At one point through the haze of her fever, she mumbled something. "Don't leave." He took her hand. "I won't." And he didn't. By now, their performance had evolved into something unspoken and dangerous, because the contract still loomed like a shadow over them. There were only a few weeks left, and neither knew what would happen when the clock ran out. Would they go back to who they were? Could they? One afternoon, she found him staring at the contract on his desk. He didn't hear her enter. "What are you doing?" she asked, wondering what happens if we tear this up. She stepped closer. "You want to end it early." He looked up. "No. I want to know what it would mean if it never ended at all." She couldn't breathe, because suddenly the truth was right there between them. Raw, unprotected, real, and terrifying. But before Ida could say the words they were choking on, the phone rang. It was Meredith, his assistant. She had news. Someone from Damien's past the press, perhaps, or someone with an agenda had discovered that Coley was hired. The story hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. And when it did, the world would know. The lie would unravel, and with it, everything they'd carefully built, real or not, might come crashing down. They stood in his office in silence, staring at each other. He reached for her hand. She pulled away, not out of anger, out of fear. "What are we doing, Damien?" He didn't answer, because he didn't know. All he knew was that the rules had broken, and so had his heart. In business, Damien Blackwell never allowed emotion to interfere with a deal. Feelings were liabilities, attachments, distractions. Every transaction he made came with airtight contracts and ironclad control. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't have prepared for, was that no spreadsheet, no document, no signed agreement could protect him from the chaos of a heart slowly learning how to love. And when the negotiations turned personal, no amount of wealth could save him. The trip to Paris was supposed to be the grand finale, the victory lap. Damien's company was finalizing the merger with one of Europe's most powerful family-run conglomerates. This deal, years in the making, would establish Damien Blackwell as a global force, untouchable, unstoppable. The final clause, a ceremonial signing between families, a dinner, a few toasts, a show of unity and tradition. And beside him, Kai, the woman he'd paid to be his. The woman he wasn't sure he could let go of anymore. They arrived in Paris in the middle of a golden evening, the sky blushing with a watercolor sunset. The hotel was historic, all marble and chandeliers and velvet corridors. Their suite overlooked the Eiffel Tower, and the air smelled of blooming lavender and tension. The staff greeted them as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell. Neither corrected it. That first night, they didn't talk much. Damien poured them each a glass of wine, and they stood by the balcony in silence, watching the city breathe. Finally, Kali spoke. "When this is over, what happens?" He didn't answer, because he didn't know. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want it to be over. The next day was all business, meetings with introductions to heirs and board members, champagne flowing like water. Coley, ever poised, played her role with astonishing grace. She remembered every name, listened intently, laughed at just the right volume. And when an investor asked how they met, she leaned into Damien's side and said softly, "He didn't charm me. He irritated me, but somehow I never wanted him to leave." Everyone laughed. Damien didn't, because she wasn't lying, and neither was he. Later that evening, they attended a formal dinner hosted by the matriarch of the rival company, an iron-willed woman who believed in family above all else. She wore pearls and suspicion and eyed Collie like a hawk. Midway through dinner, the matriarch asked a question no one else had dared. "Tell me, my dear, how does a waitress from America win the heart of a man like Damien?" The room went quiet. Wine glasses froze mid-air. Damien shifted uncomfortably. Kali, however, didn't me zabit. "I didn't win his heart," she said, her voice calm but strong. "I just never asked for it, and maybe that's why he gave it." A ripple of murmurs passed through the guests. The matriarch raised a brow, then nodded approvingly. That night, as they walked back to the hotel beneath a sky full of Parisian stars, Damien took Callie's hand. There were no cameras, no assistants, no deadlines, just the two of them tangled in something far more real than either had expected. "I meant what I said," she whispered. He stopped. "I know," he replied. "And I meant what I didn't say." She turned to him. "And this Jimmy, when he kissed her, it wasn't soft or careful. It was desperate, needing, certain." She melted into him, and the world around them blurred. Paris disappeared. Time disappeared. The contract disappeared. Only they remained. Back in their suite, they made love for the first time. No choreography, no pretense, no script, just hands and mouths and heartbeats, finding rhythm in the chaos. And in the quiet that followed, tangled in sheets and shadows, Damien whispered, "You're not part of the deal anymore." Coley touched his chest. "I never was." The next morning should have felt like a sunrise. Instead, it was a storm. They woke to dozens of missed calls and messages. The press had the story. Someone had leaked it. Damien Blackwell's fake engagement exposed. The headlines were everywhere. Photos of Kali in the cafe, her resume, the contract, leaked documents, anonymous sources. It was brutal and it was personal. Kali sat frozen on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. Her name was trending for all the wrong reasons. They're saying I scammed you, that I seduced you for money. Damien paced the room, fists clenched. "We'll find out who leaked it." Her voice broke. "It doesn't matter." "Of course it does." "No, it doesn't. Because they don't care about the truth. They'll believe whatever makes the better story." He stopped, looked at her, really looked, And for the first time, she looked like she might break. The merger was in jeopardy. Investors were spooked. The family they were negotiating with threatened to walk. Damien's empire was bleeding credibility by the hour. And yet he didn't care, because he was losing her. Kali tried to stay strong, but the press found her mother's address. Photographers camped outside her brother's school. Every mistake she'd ever made was being weaponized. And Damien didn't know how to fix it. Not with money, not with power. All he could do was hold her and whisper that he was sorry. And that, for once, didn't feel like enough. That night, she stood by the hotel window, arms wrapped around herself. I should have never said yes to you. He stepped closer. Don't say that. I was never supposed to mean anything to you. You mean everything. But I was hired. You were chosen. And now, look what it cost you. He cupped her face. I don't care about the deal, or the headlines, or what the world thinks. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. Then, what do you care about? You. The next morning, Damien called a press conference. He stood before flashing lights and shouted questions, not with a lawyer or a handler but alone. And he told the truth. He admitted to hiring Kali, explained the original purpose of the arrangement. And then he said this: I thought I could control everything in my life. I believed I could pay for loyalty, contract affection, and calculate success. But what I didn't plan for was falling in love with the one woman who never asked me for a thing. The room fell silent. And for the first time in his life, Damien Blackwell wasn't a businessman. He was a man, exposed, unarmored, human. When he returned to the suite, Kali wasn't there, only a note. Sometimes love means stepping away before you become the reason someone falls apart. Don't chase me. Not yet. Not until you know what kind of life you really want. I need to remember who I was before I became your. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it gently and placed it in the pocket over his heart. The merger collapsed. The headlines shifted to a new scandal within days. But Damien didn't care. He let it all burn because nothing mattered if she wasn't beside him. Weeks passed, and then months. And he never heard from her. Until one day, walking past that same cafe where he first saw her, he stopped. Because there she was, not behind the counter, but seated at a table by the window, reading a book. She looked up, saw him, smiled. And for the first time in a long time, everything made sense again. It started as a lie, a carefully constructed fiction, forged in paperwork and signatures, dressed in designer gowns and camera-ready smiles. It was a performance, a negotiation, a trade of time for money, appearance for convenience, but somewhere between the contracts and the red carpets, between the pretend kisses and the whispered rehearsals, something uninvited arrived. Something unscripted, something real. Love. Not the grand cinematic kind that arrives with swelling music and choreographed tears. No, this love came in quietly, in shared silence on balconies, in spoons dipped into midnight ice cream, in the way he looked at her when she wasn't looking, in the way she stayed, even when every voice told her to run. And then, like all fragile things, it was broken. Not by anger, not by betrayal, but by the weight of the lie they'd built it upon. When Damien found Kali again, she was no longer the waitress from the cafe. Not exactly, That woman was still there. Yasen, the way she stood, grounded and strong, in the way she looked people in the eye, like she wasn't afraid of their judgments. But now there was something else in her. Stillness, peace, maybe even forgiveness. She was seated alone, sipping coffee, a book open on the table one he recognized. The Great Gatsby. Ironic, he thought. A story about illusions, reinvention, and a man chasing a dream that was never real. Only this, Jimmy. The dream was real, and it was sitting in front of him. He entered the cafe without a word, walked to her table. She looked up, not surprised, like she'd been waiting, or like she'd simply known he would come. He gestured to the empty chair across from her. She nodded. And just like that, they were face to face again. "I'm not that man anymore," Damien said after a long silence. The one who thought he could negotiate his way into happiness? Kali didn't reply. "Not yet. I tried to control everything," he continued. "Even love. I treated it like a risk I could minimize. A variable I could write out of the equation. But I couldn't. Because the moment you walked into my life, everything changed." Still, she said nothing. He swallowed. "I've spent months trying to undo the damage. Not just to my image. To me, I needed to learn who I was without the armor, without the money, without you." "And what did you find?" she finally asked. "Myself and the space you left behind." She closed her book, folded her hands. "You hurt me. I know. You put me in the center of your lie. And then you made me want it to be true. I know. And I walked away because I couldn't be someone's performance. You weren't." He leaned forward. "You were the truth outside the cafe." The city moved on as if the world wasn't being rewritten at a tiny table in the corner of a crowded street. But inside, everything slowed. Kali looked at him for a long moment. And then she reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. He opened it. Inside was the original contract, ripped in half. "I tore it up the night I left," she said softly, "because I didn't want our story to end with a signature." He looked at the torn papers, then at her. "Is this a blank page?" she said. "For whatever comes next, no contracts, no performances, just you and me." He couldn't speak. He didn't need to, because when he stood, and she stood too, and they met halfway around the table, it wasn't a kiss born from a deal. It was a choice, a decision. Final, fierce, free. The press would later try to spin it, try to figure out whether they'd reconciled for publicity or profit. But it didn't matter, because they stopped performing, they stopped pretending, they just lived. A year later, they returned to Paris. Not for business, not for deals, but for each other. He proposed not with a diamond the size of a fist, not on a yacht or during a gallabut in the same suite where they once played. Pretend he got on one knee. No press, no contract. Just a question. She said yes, because this time it was real. At the wedding, there were no choreographed dances, no extravagant speeches, just the vows they wrote in ink and sealed with tears. "I fell for you when I wasn't supposed to feel," she whispered at the altar, "and I became myself. he said. When I stopped being the man who hired you and started being the man who couldn't live without you, they didn't live happily ever after. Because love, real love, isn't a straight line or a perfect ending. There were arguments, late nights, moments of doubt, but there was also truth and laughter, and mornings filled with pancakes and the fire alarm still going off, because she always burned the last one on purpose. He suspected that after the third time, years later, Damien framed the torn contract. It hung in his office behind a glass panel, not as a reminder of the lie, but as a tribute to what came from it. Below it, a small engraved plaque. The best decision I ever made was losing control. Coley never went back to waitress, but she did open her own coffee shop, small, warm, filled with books and real stories. She called it Claws and Coffee. A little joke and a reminder. He worked from there most mornings, pretending to read the paper while watching her behind the counter, smiling at customers, pouring herself into something she built with her own hands. And every so often, when no one was looking, he'd slip behind the counter, wrap his arms around her waist, and whisper, "Still my favorite negotiation." And she'd whisper back, "There's no negotiation. You already lost." He'd kiss her neck, and neither of them would mind the burn on the pancakes that followed. Because love doesn't follow rules. It doesn't obey contracts. It doesn't care how it started, only that it stayed. And in the end, that was more than enough. The end.